Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Boston University for our panel discussion, The Media Landscape, How Social Journalism is Changing the News Industry. Now, I just have to say two things before we get started. First, I'd like to thank a few people here. Mary Tunney, Kira Edler, Lauren Davala, and Jenny McIntosh, who were definitely instrumental in bringing this whole thing together. And, of course, Colin Riley. Colin Riley and Dick Tate are also here, who helped out along the way as well. Now, as you can see, tonight's panel discussion is being recorded by BU Productions. So during the Q&A session, which we're going to have in about 45 minutes, just make sure there are two young ladies that are going to bring microphones to you if you have a question. Just make sure you have the mic in hand before you start your question so we can record your entire question or statement. And of course, this is going to be uploaded to all BU's social networks, as well as BU Universe, which is kind of Boston University's version of our YouTube channel. So this is the part of the session you're probably going to fast forward through. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, founder of Help a Reporter Out, which has become the standard for thousands of journalists on deadline looking for sources. He's also founder and CEO of the Geek Factory, Inc., a boutique marketing and PR strategy firm located in New York City. And he's author of Can We Do That? Outrageous PR Stunts That Work and Why Your Company Needs Them. He's also a proud BU alum. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Peter Shankman.
Thank you. I'm beyond honored to be here. I was sharing this with my esteemed panelists a little earlier before we started. I am chairing or moderating, I suppose, a panel of that includes the dean of the Boston University College of Communication and associate professors and really smart journalists and people from all around the world in a building across the street from the College of Communications, where 18 years ago I was told by a professor, you're really probably never going to make it in the journalism industry. You might want to consider a new profession. Tonight is better than 10 years of therapy. This is just awesome. I was also told by my panel that I should tell a little brief history of me. So what I'm going to do is introduce everyone first, and I'll go last, and then we're going to launch, because I don't want to waste a lot of time on introductions, because we have really brilliant people here today with some spectacular views on where media is going. I will say a couple of house rules. The hashtag is BU Media. Anything said here is tweetable. We encourage you all to tweet out, blog, post, anything you want. We don't consider it rude if you spend the entire time looking down. It's a sign of that you like what we're doing. So the hashtag is hashtag BU Media, and I'm going to introduce all the way on the other side is Tom Fielder, the dean of BU College Communications. You all have his bio in front of you. I will tell you, though, that I once won $100 in a bar bet because I knew the name of the boat that Gary Hart was photographed with the model on, and it was called the Monkey Business. And that actually, someone said, I'll ask you the hardest question you'll never know at night. For some reason, that always stuck in my head, and I won that. So Tom began his tenure as Dean of Comm in June of 2008, following a ridiculously distinguished career in journalism at the Miami Herald. There are Pulitzers galore. I'm not going to waste time in reading things that you can all read. After that, Lisa Vanderpool is a broadcast editor reporter at the Boston Business Journal. When she was at Adweek, I bothered her tremendously and nonstop when I ran my PR firm. And I brought that up, and she remembered it, unfortunately. She maintains the Boston Business Journal's Twitter account. She appears regularly on WBZ. And prior to joining BBJ, she was at Adweek, where she covered pretty much everything in advertising in New England. We have Adam Gaffin, who's the founder and editor of Universal Hub. It's a community and news and information site keeping readers up to date on life in Boston through original reporting and curated accounts, photos from Boston area bloggers, tweeters, and photographers. 25 years as a reporter and editor at weekly, daily newspapers, and a national trade journal. And then finally, Steve Quigley, an associate professor at BU College Communications, and a member of the BU Public Relations faculty for over 10 years, coordinator of the COM Public Relations program for the past 4, teaching a wide variety of PR courses, including new media and public relations. He's also a PR consultant. I pretty much have my bio here. I was very fortunate in that with 18 credits to go in graduate school, I lost my financial aid The government sent my parents a letter, sent me a letter that said, your parents make too much money. I sent them a letter back that said, yes, my parents do make too much money, however, they keep it. The government didn't buy that. I moved back home and is there anyone under 30 here in the audience? I was hanging out in something at the time called the Melrose Place TV Gossip Chat Room on something called America Online. And back then you had a big computer that had a cord coming out of it that connected to something called a modem. The modem connected to a cord that connected to a phone, and the phone connected to a cord to the wall, because back then phones were connected to walls. And I was in this chat room, and someone said, you should submit your resume. We are trying to build a newsroom, and I did, and I was 2 weeks later hired as the founding editor of AOL News. So I was one of the original editors at America Online, helping to launch the newsroom. From there, I moved back to New York, started a PR firm, sold it, started a couple of other social media companies, sold it, and then most recently, through just knowing everyone, reporters would call me and ask me if I had sources, and it took way too much of my time, so I launched a little thing on Facebook to help some reporters out, and Help a Reporter Out was born. And Harrow is the largest source repository in the world for journalists and sources, giving about 200,000 sources access to about 150 queries a day from journalists all around the world, ranging from the Wall Street Journal to New York Times to Adweek to the Boston Business Journal to the Boston Globe to everything in between. It is a 100% free service on all sides. It is supported by advertising, and in June of this year, it was acquired by Vocus Incorporated out of Washington, D.C. So that is sort of my life, and I'm just, again, very honored to be here, and let's launch into it if that works for everyone on the... Let's start off with a very simple, softball question. In today's day and age, where I'm keeping my phone here because we're waiting to see when the first Chilean miner is supposed to come out, when we all have access to this and countless bounds of information, what is news? I'm not going to say who should start. I'm just going to open it up.
Well, there's more than one kind of news. There's news that you're interested in but doesn't really affect you. Chilean miners, it's a fascinating story, but it's not like my life changes because I know what happened to them. There's news that does affect you directly. This morning, a commuter rail train hit somebody in West Newton, and the entire line was blocked. That's news that's important to me. It would be important to me if I were on that train. There's all kinds of news. Just like traditionally, newspapers have all kinds of sections. And you can flit in and out of them.
I'm not sure I'm going to add anything to that good question because I thought Peter was going to start with softball questions. But
Really thought it was?
I'm older than Peter. I remember when air, television, and water were free.
Someone tweet that.
I think that's what we're going to try to explore tonight, and I think maybe the answer to that will come out over some conversation. But one of the perspectives that I'm hoping to bring to the table is that this notion that we should make a clear distinction between traditional media and traditional news and social media and social news is one that I think we should disabuse one another of. And I think that these phenomena are so intertwined that it's impossible in many instances to separate them.
Can I take a quick crack at that? And I would agree that news takes on many different definitions. News is an event happening, like what's happening in Chile, and that's of interest to us. But I think in general, news is the old saying that when man bites dog, that's news, and when dog bites man, that's predictable. So that's part of it when something surprising happens. And I think in general it's just when we learn something that we didn't know before, but more important that we learn something that we're pleased we did learn, that it has some value to us to know that. If it's we don't think of it as news if we heard something that just is totally irrelevant, which is why at any one time, all over the world, there are things happening, maybe not quite as interesting as miners coming out of a shaft in Chile after almost 70 days there, but there are things happening all over the world right now that we're not interested in. So it doesn't become news. News has to have some framework that makes us want to receive it and somehow say that had value to it. So I think news is something we learned, we didn't know, and it has some meaning to us for some reason.
And I think that, talking about news and when you ask that question, I started thinking about what we were talking about earlier in the respectable sources and, who's giving that news. When you talk about the Chilean miners, even if it's not a journalist who's tweeting about what's going on, I think it's still news if there are people on the ground talking about what they're seeing. And so, that even if it's not a respected source, if it's just someone out there on the ground, I still want to know, what they're seeing and hearing about it.
Let me ask another question. Raise your hand in the audience if you have a cell phone on you without a camera in it. 2 people, 3 people. So when they go to upgrade off their cheap-ass plans next year, they're going to find it virtually impossible to do so, to buy a phone without a camera in it, because they no longer sell them. And as a matter of fact, I consult with the Pentagon, and you have to leave your cell phone in a locker when you go in, because you're not allowed to bring it on the off chance that you film anything. And I said, well, what happens if I take it in? They said, we have a cell phone removal tool. And the guy took out a hammer. So that brings up a secondary question. We have, and Dean Fielding, you mentioned a really interesting point on this. If in this country alone we're 365 million people with the ability to report on news, and I'm not going to say the ability to be journalists, because you made a very interesting point that we don't have 365 million journalists. But if we have 365 people that are willing and able, as we see just by going online and looking at CNN iReports and things like that are willing and able to become news reporters at any given, reporters of news as opposed to news reporters. How do we figure out what to listen to? How do we figure out what information is worth following when they're coming at us so quickly? And B, what is a journalist?
Can I try?
Please.
I think one of the things that we don't confuse news and information. They're not the same thing. Information, we know what time the bus is going to be here. That's information. What time a plane takes off, that's information. That's not news. In order for there to be news, it's like several data points that have to come together. It's a piece of information. It is context in which that's happening, so that the context matters. Doesn't matter particularly that a politician may say something every day, but if that politician is running for governor of New York and says something really stupid about gays, and he's running for governor and the
Just
election's away, that's information that because of the context becomes news. And I'm sorry I mentioned that candidate, because now my next part is more difficult. I think journalism is when you have information, there's a context for that information, there's integrity that surrounds that information. It's been verified, at least to the best ability that we have. And ideally, there is some wisdom that comes from it. This wisdom meaning that with this information in this context that you can trust, this can flow from it. We understand something a little bit better. And that's, to me, you put those together, and that's what good journalism is, and I recognize a lot of bad journalism, but that's what good journalism is. It's a collection of those 4 things and maybe more. By themselves, they're not quite journalism.
I think the issue of context is very important. One of the things that I do a lot is I spend my life in Twitter now, and the number of people, a lot of people will post a photo, they'll post some incident, they'll post some funny anecdote that happened to them on some subway line, but a lot of times they'll leave out some key fact, like, okay, so this funny thing happened to you, but on which line? When? So that's where, if I think it's a good enough thing to retweet, I'll ask them, where did this happen? Try to fill in the context. It's not an investigative piece of journalism. It's not, something that'll win a Pulitzer, but it's an interesting little thing in 140 characters. And I think, I think where you're heading with your question is, if we have 365 million people with cameras, do we need reporters or journalists? And I think the answer is we do, because of the context that journalists are trained to ask these additional questions. Somebody with a camera takes a great picture, but they may not know to ask these questions or supply the information that would make it a news story.
I'm not a journalist, so I'm not sure I should be addressing this, but one of the best lessons I got on maybe what is news is was from a Globe reporter who's since retired, who, when I was pitching him, because I'm on the other side of the street as a public relations person, when I was pitching him on a story that I was fairly convinced he would be interested in, and he wasn't, he pointed out to me that the Globe doesn't get paid to write about the planes that land safely at Logan. And at first, I was outraged, upset, because I thought, what a pathetic world we live in. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that that wasn't a bad little guide that I should take with me in my travels, because my guess is that if in fact the Globe chose to write about the planes that landed safely at Logan, you and I would maybe read it the first day and might glance at it the second day, and on the third day we'd skip over it, and that would be the end of that section. So from the other end of the spectrum, that's been a handy lesson for me.
I was going to say that I think that I agree with you all. I think that, we need journalists, and journalists are, I believe in the traditional definition of journalists. I don't think that everybody out there tweeting random bits of information are journalists. And I think that, but I think it's interesting, social media has definitely been sort of a trap for some reporters, traditional reporters. We were talking about what happened during the Tom Brady car crash, and there were some traditional TV reporters so quick to jump on Twitter tweeting incorrect facts about the incident. So I think it's interesting that, when you're in that realm of Twitter and social media, even trusted traditional reporters aren't always saying the right things. I mean, I guess that's true in any, print or television medium as well. But and there was another recent incident with the whole Randy Moss trade, where a reporter, I can't remember his name, supposedly it was supposed to be a DM, a direct message, but he said Moss Vikings, and that just sort of set off the whole rumor that that he was going to get traded, which he was. So I just think it's interesting, because those are both. I mean, he was kind of. I think maybe he was a blogger, but yeah.
I don't know about you, but I don't use the DM feature just because it's way too easy to screw it up.
Well, right.
Because it looks too much like a text message when you get a new BlackBerry. Won't use it.
Yeah, no.
You actually raised a really good point. I actually believe will always be a place for journalists. I wasn't going to go there. I'm not, and I always ask people when I do my speeches, how many of you got your news from a newspaper? And a few of them tentatively raise their hands. Like, I'm not going off on a rant that they're dying, and then half the audience raises their hand. But let me ask this. You raised an interesting point. Yes, there will always be a place for journalists, but here's how I see sort of where we've gone in that regard in terms of news in the past 100 years. For the past 100 years, information has flown from outside the network in the respect of, honey, what do you want to do this weekend? Oh, well, let's see what the New York Times tells us to do. Or what do you want to do for dinner? Let's see what the Boston Globe recommends. Or let's see what the movie reviewer says we should go see, or information like that. What we're finding now is we have the tools to allow information for the first time ever to flow from inside the network out. What do you want to do tonight? Let's see what Nancy, who's the first person in our network, who's our best friend on Facebook and who tweets all the time, we trust her, let's see what she's telling us to do. That implies, and that brings in a much more implied level of trust. Because if Nancy screws you and you go to a restaurant and get botulism, you're going to call her the next morning. And she's in trouble. You're not going to call the restaurant reviewer and say, your lousy review got me ill. So if we're moving towards a level of trust and almost connected interactivity in that regard, how do we then look at journalists in the respect when they're giving us information? Do we still have the same level of trust that we always have, number one? And number two, do we have the same level of trust for them as we do for people in our network who might recommend something? Because if you could argue that newspapers are dying, I would say the only reason they are in fact dying is because of those people whose job it was to tell us how to think are the ones who might be going away. Not the journalists per se, not the investigative journalists, not the reporters covering news, but the ones who gave their opinion, the reviewers, the critics, things like that. So if there is still a place for the journalist in news, in this sort of social net that we all live in, where is that place? And anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I was just going to say, I still think that journalists, reporters are in a position where they're, they can be experts in whatever field you're talking about, if you're talking about restaurants or movies. So I still think that, I might be more inclined to trust, a reporter more than my friend down the street who isn't an expert in that area. So I still think that, they're just automatically going to, be respected sources.
Well, unfortunately, I think if you look at surveys of the least trusted professions in America, there's congressmen, car salesmen, and journalists. So I'm not sure that the trust issue is necessarily as big a thing. What I think is interesting is that for the first time, we don't have to listen to Dan Shaughnessy. You know, we can say to Dan Shaughnessy, "Screw you."
We never said that before.
Well, you may have, but now there's a whole community of people out there who hate him. You know, so that what's happening is you're seeing alternate networks spring up, and you're seeing some journalists begin to take advantage of that. Peter Abraham at the Globe is a columnist who does a very good job at social media. I'm going to get her name wrong. Emily Benjamin. You know, she's tweeting in the middle of Red Sox games. If you're really into the Red Sox, that's a great thing. Shaughnessy, meanwhile, you know, just sits there and gets angry about everything. I think what social media lets you do is you know, fight back. I mean, just look at what happened today, I think it was, with the Gap. They came out with, well, I think it's a stupid issue. They came out with a new logo, and apparently everybody in the design community hated it. And they hated it so much that all they did for 3 days was complain about this, and the Gap decided they're going back to the old logo because everybody told them the new logo was terrible. That's something that probably wouldn't have happened, you know, 10 years ago. Because who would organize a protest over this? But a tweet, yeah. You know, yeah, they listen to them.
Yeah.
You've been suspiciously quiet.
Oh, I think you have a point, Peter. I do think that if you look at what we thought of as the mainstream media, where it was, you used the phrase from outside in, I thought of from top down, where you listened on high to these people who were the clergy of all things, and they were the arbiters of fashion or taste and so forth. That's where you do see that the model has collapsed, because people will say, well, what gives that person the right to say I should like this movie and not like that, or that film, and so forth. So in many cases, it's particularly more difficult for local media and the metro media to sustain that. I still think there are people who have they have earned particular integrity because they have insight that has been something that I think people look for. A.O. Scott, a film critic for the New York Times, for instance, you read his film criticism, and Jane, just blanked on her last name, and at the New Yorker on film. In any event, there are some people who over time have really earned a place where you want to see what they have to say. And in some respects, I think of Dan Shaughnessy, you read what he has to say because maybe you want to get mad, and it prompts a conversation. He's the kind of person that if you're in a carpool, he's always the one that's kvetching and complaining, and after a while you want to throw him out, but the carpool's really dull unless he's there. So there are going to be some people like that you do want. But by and large, I think that journalism is in some ways going back to its fundamentals, which isn't a bad thing, which is to build its core around, essentially, as I said, finding that information that fits that definition of news and putting it out there so that there is perhaps a baseline of knowledge that the rest of us can benefit from. And sometimes I have to say that the information that a good journalist will use can come from the 350 other million people who are out there listening and now have a way to communicate that they previously didn't. But that top-down model, by and large, I think is it's not going away, but it is shrinking. It's going back to its core. Alex Jones, who's the director of the Shorenstein Center over at the Kennedy School at Harvard, he talks about that as the iron core right now, and I think he's got a point there that iron core is still very important to us as a society, as a democracy, and I don't see that going away.
And I would just add to that as an organizational communicator, what's exhilarating for me is not either or, right? Not gatekeeper or no gatekeeper, but the fact that we now have the option as organizational communicators to do both, right? To rely on those powerful, intelligent, seasoned gatekeepers to filter our message and pass it through to our audiences, but now we have the option as well, obviously, of being able to go directly to our audiences. And so it's really an either or for me. In fact, Adam mentions the the Gap logo controversy, and I, for one, today, after reading my 4,000th tweet about the Gap Gate or whatever it was, I thought, where are the gatekeepers? Please, somebody kill this conversation, because it's not that interesting.
I was doing CNN. I got asked to do CNN this morning, and they called me. And I think when I should do CNN, I'm like, oh, good, something worldwide, and it's about the miners. No, it's about the Gap. I'm like, you gotta be joking. Like, this is news. It brought up an interesting question. Let's talk for a second about it. You said integrity and authenticity and trust. Let's talk for a second about trust. We are in an age where anyone can post anything, and it really is up to so if the mainstream media is going to broadcast it and going to make it massive, from one person can have one follower on Twitter. If that one follower retweets to an audience and something grows and something grows and something grows, you have it from there. You had a couple of years ago, and I brought this up earlier, someone posted on their blog that Steve Jobs had a heart attack, and CNN ran with it with no factual check, and Apple stock dropped about 9 or 10 points in a matter of seconds, and then they pulled it, and they said, okay, our bad. So there's a much stronger sort of will out there now to check as much as humanly possible, because if you're relying more and more on citizen journalists to help support your news, I read some stat that, I don't remember the percentage, but a good percentage of the 2008 election coverage up until the night of the election was citizen journalism. And so if you have, on the major networks, if you have that, where does trust play a role, and how do we then sort of, as we move more into that, how do we start defining, okay, I can trust this person or not this person? If you look at, there's a website, Slashdot and Dig, and what they're famous for is they on the comments section, they have a rating system based on how other users either perceive, like, or dislike the person's comments, and that they assign a number to that person, a 1 through 5, and you can set your comment filter to only get numbers, 3 or above, or 2 below, or whatever the case may be. Are we moving towards that kind of a system in journalism if we're inviting more and more people to participate in the conversation? I was totally overreading your notes here, where you said that, what's the number that some percentage of 37% of people have contributed to news creation?
I'd said that.
Isn't that great? He said that 37% of people have contributed to news creation, commented on news, or shared it via social media sites such as Facebook. So in an age where everyone has died on Twitter at least once, how do we create a barrier of trust?
I don't know.
I guess we don't. Okay. So good luck to you all.
I think it would be scary if you started rating reporters.
Well, I mean, think of it, not reporters,
you're
but
talking
if
about
everyone has the ability to report on news.
Well, and isn't that kind of what clout is all about? Isn't clout, I guess that's more of a marketing thing.
Well, but it does have a level of relevance. And my question is, are we going to create some sort of level of
But I think
relevance
you're
for those
right.
people who want
Yeah,
to?
I think you're right. I think that, you have to, obviously you can't just go on Twitter and start, believing everything that everybody's tweeting. You just don't. And so, if people want to start getting credibility as citizen journalists, I think that's a good idea.
Who was the journalist who did that a couple of months ago? He called it an experiment. Anyone remember that? He said he tweeted something, a blatant lie.
Oh yeah, the experiment.
it Washington Post, I think
it was another sports thing.
Right, a sports
Yeah,
journalist.
and
So it was an experiment, and he
said
tweeted
wanted to
something,
see-
and it went.
He wanted to see who would repeat what he
Right.
said, but he's a Washington Post journalist, and then he went back and he said that he regretted doing it. He should have done it from a different Twitter account. I mean, it's crazy to do something like that. But yeah, and then like CNN retweeted it, and
Let me see if I can, because
And
go
yet
ahead.
40 years ago, there was an infamous case in New York where I think it was the New York Post, back before Murdoch, was stealing the numbers. No, they were stealing sports results from college basketball games from the Daily News. So the Daily News put in some fake scores to
Oh
see if-
wow,
Yeah.
really?
Oh
So
my God.
it's not like this is necessarily just an issue of citizen journalists.
Yeah.
But it's like, why do you trust the New York Times? Because over a period of time, you've read them and you've come to, or don't trust them, as the case may be. You come to realize that they agree with your mindset, that they seem to be accurate. I think it's the same thing on social media. Over time, you get to see, is this person accurate? Because one of the things that you do have in social media is the correction factor. With the Tom Brady stories, both of them, people were correcting that pretty quickly. So within 15 minutes, if you were following this, you knew that Tom Brady was not driving his Bentley, that he was driving whatever, an Audi or whatever it was. So there's now a sort of almost an automatic filter where people are correcting you. And if somebody keeps getting corrected, you start saying,
Yeah.
that's not somebody I want to follow.
Yeah.
Wikipedia is kind of an interesting case study in that regard. When Wikipedia started, the concept was that the wisdom of the crowd, that something would go out there and over time everybody knew something that could contribute to a whole, and so you would have more and more good information. But what they quickly found is that the ether is full of a lot of bad information too. So Wikipedia's problem initially when it was started was its credibility. People would post some terrible things on Wikipedia. That I forgot the name of the former attorney general who was accused of having gone to Russia and collaborated in the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and in any event, it all turned out, obviously, as to be terribly false, and Wikipedia was embarrassed by that. In fact, they were sued over that and a number of other things. But what has happened with Wikipedia, that is, 6, 7 years old? It's not that old now, but it has gone through. It has started out with the idea that the crowd is wise, the crowd will ultimately will police everything. It's like when a posse comes and order is restored to the town. But it learned that that wasn't quite enough, that you had to have some people in there, use the word curator in what you do, that you had to have some people who really were trustworthy and had earned that position of authority come in and sit over the crowd a little bit and say, well, maybe a little, let's leave that out, and to have a little place in there where let's isolate this new piece of information and make sure it doesn't have some little disease that'll infect the rest, and let's test it out. So now Wikipedia has put into place what is really the old-fashioned system that we used to call editors, and that's and the same thing. Huffington Post has done the same thing. The Daily Beast, those started out as kind of Wild West bloggers, and now Huffington Post is hiring, dare I say it, mainstream journalists to edit what they do, because there is a place for the curator in this, and it's a complement. It's not a competition. It's a complement with an E in there, complement, that I think is a good thing.
I have an interesting question. Going back to integrity for a second, if you look at sort of what has become what we consider acceptable news, has the internet and social, as it were, changed what we used to consider, what we consider now acceptable news versus what we used to consider? If you look at, someone posed this interesting question. Imagine if TMZ existed in 1960. If TMZ existed in the era of Mad Men, okay, would it have survived, or would it have been, arrested for morality issues? And I'll take it a step further. If the people we're following and the people we're getting our news from that we believe, the ones we believe, if there is a level of trust and integrity there, how do you explain Perez Hilton? For instance, how do you explain the levels of what TMZ is passing for news? Has news changed from what people want to read because we find it interesting to what generates 3 million clicks or 4 million views or things like that?
I'm old enough to remember Walter Winchell, so I really don't think it's changed. What has changed, perhaps, is the ubiquity of what's out there. But I think we've seen a Perez Hilton kind of a person going back as long as there was mass media. Somebody who would be out there kind of saying wild and crazy things about people that touches on maybe a little bit salacious, and we're all interested in gossip, and we want to also hear about the bad things that celebrities have done. And I think that really goes back a long, long way. That's part of the human condition. But mass media has allowed that to propagate, and of course now we're in the age of almost unrestrained media, so it's just gotten louder and louder and louder.
Is there no difference between? I always whenever I read Perez Hilton, I'm always mad. I'm always brought back to the scene in Chicago, where the gossip journalist says, we're reporting from the scene of the courthouse where she just fainted, and it's this, they're doing live radio. As she's getting, is it no different? Is it just a little more salacious and a little more of a cleavage showing now that makes for the better photo? Is it the same as it was in the 30s? And
it's more real time. I mean, in the 30s, you would have had to wait for the hourly news broadcast or whatever. locally, one thing I've seen is that it seems like people are more willing to accept news of suicides. It used back when I was a cub reporter, unless somebody killed themselves in public, like they jumped off a building, you didn't report it because it was like, so what? I mean, not so what, but it wasn't really a news story. But there was a case in Brighton or Alston last week, I think. This 10-year-old girl killed herself in her own house, and it was in the Globe, it was in the Herald, it was, first place it was on Twitter, because, there are people out there who just listen to scanners, and all of a sudden they hear all this police and fire activity at this particular address. So the definition of, I think, what is made public is different. People jumping off I admit it, I cover people jumping off the Tobin Bridge all the time. Oh, that's a little different because it is a kind of a public place.
Are journalists still breaking the news? And the reason I'll give you two examples. I tweeted last year, or I guess it was last year now, almost 2 years ago. One of my tweets was voted one of the most important tweets of the year by some media outlet, and that tweet was, "Holy shit, a plane just flew by my window and landed outside my apartment in the Hudson."
Oh my God.
That was you?
That was, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I lived 57th Street and 11th Avenue, and it was, I mean, yeah, you just look it up, have like, what the hell was that, But, and the other tweets, of course, that broke last year, the biggest story was Michael Jackson's death.
Yeah.
It was actually the first time a celebrity had died on Twitter and was actually dead. So if you have, so the news broke, both those stories broke on Twitter.
So Michael Jackson broke on Twitter.
Michael Jackson broke on Twitter, and TMZ was the first to confirm it, but
Yeah,
it broke on Twitter,
right.
and the Hudson broke, the
Yeah.
plane and the
Yeah.
U.S. airplane.
Yeah.
So who's breaking the news? Do journalists still break news?
This is going to sound terrible, so I probably shouldn't say it.
Go ahead.
In
Now you have
some
it.
ways, this is like the blind squirrel finds an acorn kind of thing. That yes, okay. Because I should have said it, right? Because yes, you could say this story broke on Twitter, but 99 other stories that broke on Twitter were wrong. So when do you consider the story breaking? When it's verified or when it's true, but do you know it's true at that moment? When you sent that tweet, I guess it was.
I pretty much knew that was true.
You didn't know what it was. You just, what it turned out to be, somewhere along the way that there was a verification process that took hold. So I don't know when it actually, when all those ingredients became soup, so to speak. I don't know where that was. But so the moment of inception may not be the moment when it becomes news. There has to be something else that takes hold of it there.
I think especially with that story, I mean, not to discount the tweet, because
No,
that's
hey.
very cool, but
But the first photo came out on
just a-
Twitter also.
Yes.
right, but just whenever the stories started to come out a few hours later, especially with that story, I remember reading it, it was such an amazing story,
yeah.
How he was like, okay, brace yourselves, and just the whole, how he did the landing, and so even though it's true, even if you want to say, maybe technically you broke the story, just getting that, not even the next morning in the daily papers, but later on that night on CNN, it was such an amazing story to read that real
Oh, yeah.
reporting. I mean,
I don't need any credit for. I don't
Right.
believe I broke the U.S. airplane landing.
No, but-
anyone who looked out their window
yeah.
broke the U.S. airplane landing. But I think the question then becomes, that as Dean Fielder said, what qualifies as breaking? Is it because quite frankly it's holy crap, a plane landed is interesting, but wow, the heroism of blah 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 is a story.
right.
And also, there's a whole other kind of story that isn't necessarily breaking like plane crashes into the Hudson. The Globe broke the whole probation department scandal. I love people on Twitter. I love people who blog, but we're not investigative reporters for the most part. You are seeing some people do it. Josh Marshall started out as a blogger. He is now supporting investigative reporting. But tweeters are not, and bloggers are not competing with the 200-person newsroom at Morrissey Boulevard. They're going to break news, as much as I don't like to admit it, but they do. Even the Herald breaks news.
About the squirrel.
Well, and I don't want to leave this topic yet because the subject here that we were talking about is how social journalism has affected the news industry. And Adam, I think you put your finger on it when you talk about how what we think of as the mainstream news organizations will now report and things that we wouldn't have done 15 or 20 years ago. Suicides being one. We thought of suicides as being a mental illness, and so therefore you wouldn't report that because it was just untidy and perhaps made the family feel even more badly than they would anyway. So, but now when you look at the way social networking, meaning everybody who has access to information and put it out there, it has completely upended whatever ability. It's shattered the gate so that the mainstream news organizations can no longer choose not to report something because they just simply don't think it's appropriate to talk about. Now, mainstream news organizations struggle with deciding, well, maybe something Paris Hilton said, by God, we're going to have to put on our front page, or we're going to have to do something with it. And that's what's changed, is the conversation no longer can be curated. Again, you can't decide, I'm going to have this in, and therefore if we don't talk about it, nobody else will. Scandals that go on inside in politics, the whole idea that when we did the Gary Hart story, it's hard to believe, 22 years ago, I think it was, that there were a lot of news organizations that thought, what in the world are you doing? This is his private life. Can't he go off on a boat with a young woman? So, yeah, the then executive editor of the New York Times said if as a reporter he had been asked to do that story, he would have refused to do it, and as editor, he would have refused to publish it. Wow. That was the attitude. So wow. You can't do that anymore.
And also at the same time, especially with shrinking newsrooms, there are a lot of stories out there that mainstream media are missing. Not necessarily probation department scandal levels. What's happening in my neighborhood? 3 years ago, actually it was maybe 5 years ago, I was coming home from work. 2 kids were shot at rush hour on the main street in my neighborhood. They had helicopters overhead. The street was shut down at rush hour. Not a word of it ever showed up in the Globe or the Herald or any of the TV stations. So that, whereas I was able to write about just because I happened upon it trying to get home, there's a lot of stuff out there that's happening that mainstream media is not covering, especially at the local level. And I think what's happening is you're starting to see organizations like Patch, which is an America Online thing, they're filling a hole that the Globe is. They're trying to make up with their Yorktown sites, but there's just a ton of stuff out there. Yeah, yes, exactly.
Put in a plug for that.
I want to open it up for questions in about 3 or 4 minutes, but I want to ask really one more question. Back in the 80s, again, this is for those under 30. Back in the 80s, a bunch of business executives got together and said, we're going to take the songs you hear on the radio. Radio was Pandora before the internet. They said, we're going to take the songs you hear on the radio and we're going to create little movies about them. We're going to call those movies videos, and we're going to start actually a TV station to play these videos. We're going to call it MTV and music television. Now, I know for the under 30 crowd that's mind-blowing, because for as long as you've been alive, MTV's been a reality channel. But before Jersey Shore, and before, I'm 12 and pregnant, what's the latest? Before that, MTV played these videos, and senators, I'm sure you remember the senators were up in arms about MTV, and they were holding hearings about the dumbing down of America. The dumbing down of America because America was going to lose the Japanese, and I remember Ed Meese, someone held this hearing, that America's going to lose the Japanese because MTV is giving Americans a 3-minute attention span. As journalists, as publicists, we'd give our right arm to have an audience with a 3-minute attention span right now. Some studies have said the average attention span is roughly about 2.6 seconds, which equates to roughly 140 characters. So if we're in an era where everything we say has to be tweeted and has to be in short burst downtime, I say that killing America is not our attention span, but that bad writing is killing America. How do we compete in an age where everyone considers themselves a writer and everyone considers themselves a broadcaster, except I actually got a cover letter 2 months ago for someone who wanted to, from Harvard, I should add, who wanted to take a job with me, and the last line of the cover letter, it's a great resume, and the last line of the cover letter said, again, I reiterate how much I would enjoy the opportunity for working for you. For you.
No.
Oh yeah. So if we're in an age of that, is good writing dead? And if good writing isn't dead, who's keeping it alive?
I'll say no. It's not dead. I think actually Twitter in some ways can help focus your writing because you only have 140 characters. It's a great way to become a headline writer.
That's very true.
But also, I mean, Twitter has links. I think if somebody really cares about a story, the Chilean miners thing, I'm not just going to rely on Twitter. There's a lot of links in that, to video, to all sorts of information that 20 years ago, I'd be getting the Globe, I'd have one source. Now it's like I have the whole world to me, coming to me. So, there's always been kids that can't write. And that's been a perpetual problem in the United States for a long time. So I don't think it's the internet.
Do you think it's getting, so it's not getting worse or better or anything like that? The internet's not affecting that?
I think it's different. I mean, 20 years ago, kids were not writing OMG and LOL, but there was probably something else that they were writing.
Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, speaking of short attention span, I realize that my comments are 2 questions behind, but I'm going to try it anyways. But I'm actually trying to pick up on what Peter just said, but there's a quote from this guy, Joseph Jaffe. Some of you, I suspect, read his books or follow his blog, that he says, it's harder than ever to get people's attention for 30 seconds, but it's much easier than ever to get certain people's attention for hours, right? I think that's a really important point. Some of this social media stuff is liberating us from the confines of the 30-second, spot, the attention-grabbing relationship, where if we target our messages and if we write well, but we target our messages clearly for those limited number of folks who are really interested in what it is that our organization has to say, I think your company is proof positive that we have the potential to develop sustained, mutual, valuable relationships with people over years, days, weeks, months. So anyways, that was that's the first question. I missed the second one when Tom mentioned shattering the gate, I think it was. And I was thinking, well, I don't know about shattering the gate, but I do remember a great quote about pulling back the curtain a little bit. And it was in relation to social media. And it was, I think it was John Meacham speaking at a conference I attended. And he said, we've come a long way, back 35, 40 years ago, Walter Cronkite, when he said that's the way it is, obviously many of us thought, okay, that's the way it is. But I think now the curtain's been pulled back in a way that I think is probably more transparent and more honest and more healthy in some ways, where, this is his line, obviously not mine, where he said today, if he were alive, he would say, well, we did the best we could do. We worked really hard to try to make sense of the crazy world that we all live in, and we squeezed it into the 23 minutes that we're allowed to bring this information to you. And in some ways, I think that's really sad, but in other ways, I think it's really liberating that we can now have that kind of honest connection to media outlets that perhaps we couldn't have before.
To go to your point of getting the information, to go to your point of you can hold people for hours, and your point of getting the information, a breaking news alert just came out that they have now announced the official order in which all 33 miners are expected to come to the surface, and you can actually catch a chart, and I guess when each person comes up, cross them off, sort of like a play-by-play. We want to open it up for questions. We have about 15 minutes left. If there are questions, I know we have microphones that are floating around somewhere in the back, so if you do have a question, please go up to said microphone and ask said question, I suppose. Or the microphone's going to come to you. Because this is BU, and that's what we do here.
Thank you. I just want to ask about a recent thing. I feel as if the social media and the Twitter and the citizen journalists, having been a trained journalist, are more spectators. We're having a lot of look at this, look at that. And I love the on the ground because you're getting people who are showing us something as it happens. But an example that really dismayed me recently was the big sludge flood, the aluminum flood in Hungary. And for a good solid week, I watched the networks report that. And all the reportage was look and see. Look and see. They'd show it. They'd talk to people on the ground. They'd show it to us. But really, for almost a week, no one mentioned the source or the genesis of that. In those reports, nothing was said about the companies and the companies. There was not a word about responsibility in a lot of the reporting. Recently now, I know Jim Lehrer reported on the company, and there's been an arrest. It took a good week to hear anything about that. So what I'm wondering is, when we talk about gatekeepers today, love to be able to see all those eyes on the ground instead of a talking head in the CNN studio. That thrills me because we all know reporters aren't being sent out the way they used to. But at the same time, there was such a, who's the advocate? I think gatekeepers, I'd like to know what you feel about the gatekeepers and the professional journalists, at least letting the people know, again, to play that watchdog role, to advocate for the public's greater good and to be the truth tellers. I think so much has become the shallow, everybody look, and we're all appreciative and it's exciting. The whole TMZ thing is exciting. It appeals to the immediacy of Twitter and social and all the rest of it. But if everyone's a spectator, then who's the advocate? Who's the watchdog for the public? Whether or not that entails some ego to name yourselves the watchdogs. But I relied on that, and I think we're losing a lot of that. But I'd like to know how you feel about that.
I think just to start with, good journalism is hard. It requires a lot of work, a lot of knowledge, a lot of training on the part of the person who does it, a lot of verification that goes on. Just to mention that story about the toxic sludge, I think what happens, particularly at a time when resources of news organizations are shrinking, is the medium involved will default back to what is its essential power, and it becomes hostage to that. So what we saw, I think you're talking mostly about television, what you saw were lots of pictures of mud, ugly mud going around, looking terrible, and people being alarmed, and very little information beyond that for quite a while on television. Because that's, I think, the reality is that what has happened, particularly with U.S. networks, frankly, I didn't see what BBC did, but my guess is they would have done it better, is that you have news organizations that are buying pictures from, essentially syndicates out there that were sending in this video and then trying to report from New York or Washington what they thought they were seeing. And it took a while for the hard work, which is who's responsible, how did they make this mistake, where was the regulatory oversight, what will happen now, all of that kind of thing, which I think we require, which a real journalist would do. It took a while for that to catch up. But television, forgive me for saying this for my friends in television becomes hostage to the picture. And the same thing with the terrible floods that struck in Pakistan for a week. That's all we saw were the pictures. Of course, what can you do? You can't blame nature for being at fault for that. So again, the mediums will move to their bases. And for newspapers, the world I came out of, that's the strength of newspapers is to tell the story that doesn't have a picture that goes with it. It's to do the investigation into how the probation department in Massachusetts became so scandal-ridden. There's no picture there to tell that story, but it really matters to the public purse, and we may be seeing some sectioning that goes on. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
Remember Donahue?
Yeah.
This question is actually from Twitter. It's from someone who wanted to be here tonight, but he's sick. So he's following
on
the
Twitter,
hashtag.
not Twitter itself.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
Twitter didn't
The day that
properly
Skynet
ask
became
this question.
self-aware.
He wants to know, what training are newsrooms doing to acclimate journalists with new media tools?
Good newsrooms are converting to new media, and I'm talking about newsrooms, not just newspaper newsrooms, but television newsrooms, and it's all converging so that ultimately people will be able to get news when they want it and in what mode they want it, and it'll all come on our smartphone. And it won't matter to you whether that news originally or that journalism originated in what had been a newspaper-based newsroom or had been a television-based or whatever it is, because to you it's all just delivered right here, and if you can trust it, the original source doesn't really matter, becomes irrelevant. So what are, the question is, it's a very good one, is good newsrooms are converting themselves as fast as they possibly can to compete in that space, that converged space. If you're a newspaper nowadays and you tell your staff that they're a newspaper staff, then you're dead. You're really dead, because you're not. You happen to be a staff that produces a newspaper along with perhaps a website and maybe even audio and video too. That's where you've got to be.
I would say I was at the Society of Professional Journalists conference last week in Las Vegas, and I believe over 65% of the panels and discussions they had over the 3 days of the conference were about integrating social media into your newsroom. And that's, I mean, that was mind-blowing to me, because if you look at, what it was as much as 15 years ago, it was how to become a photographer if you were a journalist, how to be, how to make the ink dry faster, or whatever it was, and all of a sudden everything, and I look back on the stuff that I learned in just as recently as 15 years ago, 18 years ago in COM, and even at the Daily Free Press is I wanted to go over there and show them a roll of film, and so how many of you know what this is? None of you do, whippersnappers, so yeah.
I think today or yesterday, and I suspect most of you in the audience would know which day, that the BBC issued its new guidelines for incorporating social media and user-generated content into their coverage. So, good timely question from Twitter.
And that, actually, the BBC is an interesting case because, is it BBC? Yes, BBC. One of the things that they emphasize is hyperlinks to other people's content, which for a news organization is kind of revolutionary. One of my biggest issues with the Globe Online is they never link to anything. Mm-hmm. They'll write about bloggers and they won't link to their blogs. It's just like, so some people are advancing more than others.
Yeah. I agree. I think some newsrooms are much better at it than others. I know the BBC has been really great in embracing social media and telling reporters that they have to, learn it and figure it out and do it. But I think it was the New York Times that wouldn't let reporters write the word tweet.
Right.
Definitely, my newsroom, the reason why I use Twitter is because I think it's fun and I've liked it for a long time. And there are definitely reporters in my newsroom who just haven't embraced it yet. And I know it's the same thing at the Globe. I know that somewhat recently, people at the Globe, I think they gave a directive to reporters that they should be on Twitter, and that's not verified, but I think it's encouraged there. But I think it's definitely, there are still a lot of reporters that aren't that into it.
Well, the New York Times always strikes me as an awesome case study for pretty much everything in the world, because there is pretty much a directive there that says don't use Harrow. That says you're not allowed to use Harrow to find your sources, but you're allowed to use Google, and you're allowed to use Craigslist. And every reporter there uses Harrow, and they just don't. Where'd you get your report? Craigslist. Yeah. Of course, I cannot tell you the number of queries that come from the New York Times. But this is the New York Times. This is the New York Times that also when one of the first stories they ever wrote about Twitter, they called it the Twitter. And go back 25 years ago, they interviewed Meatloaf, and the entire article said, "and Mr. Loaf." So, you look at it, it's never going to change. The technology changes, but the attitudes don't.
Yeah.
I think I'm kind of fortunate. I work for an alternative weekly, so I get to kind of process stories and look at new angles on them and report them whenever I want. And I find that there's still interest out there. But as a result, I think I notice a lot more. I notice a lot of other dailies and especially television news broadcasts screwing things up because they're racing with each other to the second. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you had any insight as to how much you really feel like, and just also, I can't tell you, every night you turn on the news and they're reporting on tweets without any research, without making any phone calls. So, but what I'm wondering if you have any insight into how much news consumers, especially serious news consumers, really care about that rat race. Are they really going to favor one news outlet instead of another because they got them the same almost generic story 10 seconds earlier? Or is it okay for serious news consumers, if it's almost like, all right, we're looking into this and we'll get back to you tomorrow or something like that? Is it worth it for everybody to be so neck and neck constantly? Even more so than, I know there's always been competition, but down to the second now.
I'm sorry.
I just was going to say, it's interesting you say you work for an alternative newspaper, I guess, because I wonder nowadays in this day and age who you're the alternative to, you know, because
Well, I mean, when I say that, I mean in that, of course we do daily stuff and we're online constantly, right, for Boston Phoenix, but, you know, we also
Right.
Are they still alternative? They're
Yeah.
still alternative? Really? They were alternative when I was in school.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean that we still do a long form feature.
right.
5,000, 6,000 word features, and of course smaller stuff in between, but when I say that, I mean that we still do those kinds of, you know, take alternative takes on maybe existing stories.
Yeah, but the only reason I said that, and I didn't mean that as in any way an insult, because I think what you do is a lot of good journalism. But initially, the history of the alternative weeklies is that they were the alternatives to the big daily in town. I mean, your whole existence, the Boston Phoenix, grew up because you wanted to be able to kneecap the Globe occasionally about what they were doing and kind of hit them. And you still try to do that. The problem you're running into is there's a hell of a lot of other kneecappers out there with you now, so that you're part of a broader chorus that's, you know, chewing up the Globe every day. But be that as it may, I think the larger question that you're putting out there is there a place for the voice that tries to be the voice of reason while everyone else is still shouting? And I would say yes, that there is, but the time period in which you have to come out with your voice of reason is sharply constrained at now the news cycle, because of what we have, the spontaneity and the instantaneous ability for us to get a tweet or something will move. Even Wikipedia moves almost in real time. And so if you're going to be the voice of wisdom, you had better move, if not within the same news cycle, pretty close to it. Look at what's happened with Time and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report. They occupied that niche I think you were talking about. They would sit back and reflect on the week's events and then tell you where this all fit in the larger scheme of civilization. Boy, they're just struggling now to hang on. They're dying because it's too long. A week is too long. So I think perhaps the daily paper, still, it may be an archaic term, but that idea that every 24 hours there will be one snapshot that you take and then try to extrapolate from it. The breaking news is going to be online, but then we'll try to do that rough draft of history in the daily, I say the daily paper, but that may come to you on your smartphone and may come to you in what other form. So, but once a day. It's got to be that quick.
You know, I would say has almost survived that, and surprisingly, has become almost a mainstream read. I don't subscribe to any print magazines anymore. The ones I do, I take on the plane with me to catch up. But the Week is my survival guide at parties, because I can read the Week on a Friday and get just enough information. It's like the USA Today weekly. I get just enough information to sound intelligent. You know, because just enough. I think at this point we are pretty much running out of time. We're past 8 o'clock. I think we could probably take one or two more questions if so. So I think one and then probably two, and then that's I think about it.
For the news consumer today, if that person on a regular basis reads the New York Times, Boston Globe, The Economist, perhaps one local newspaper, and the Wall Street Journal, what, if anything, of value is brought by having to go to social media? Does that person miss out on anything of substance, or does that person miss out on anything at all?
Oh,
Yes.
snap.
Well, it gets back to the first question that we talked about, which is what your definition of news is. If you're sitting on a train stuck in Ashland, all of a sudden you have a deep and intense desire to know why that train is stuck there. You know, that's news. You're not going to get that, reading the Boston Globe. You might get that on Twitter. You might get that on Facebook. It depends which social networks you use. But there definitely is a kind of news that you're going to get from there. About 2 months ago, I saw this tweet. The guy was on the Piano Factory, which is a building in Lower Roxbury. And his tweet was simple: why is there all this smoke around here? It turned out it was a 9-alarm fire, like, maybe half a mile away. For 30 minutes, the only place you could find out about that fire was on Twitter, because mainstream media hadn't caught up for whatever reasons. Meanwhile, there were people taking photos, taking video. Boston Fire Department was posting live updates. On a weekly basis, no, that's not going to inform you on who to vote for. But if your room is filling up with smoke, you want to know right away. So there is a niche for this. There is a kind of news that you want to get from there.
I would say it also determines it's based on your personality. I am a junkie in that regard. Is that I want to know what's happening when if the end train doesn't come within 4.5 minutes, something's wrong, and I want to tweet and find out why. So for me, the value lies in the immediacy and information I can't get on, that I don't want to wait for until the following morning. A perfect example for that is for, I'd say, about 5 years when I would travel, I would always go to 1010wins.com. They had probably one of the most updated, here's what's going on in New York websites out there until Twitter was born. And I have a New York list of people who break New York news because they're based in New York and they're on that. And I don't go to the website anymore on the road. I go to this list and I find out everything's going on almost immediately. There must be 15 different people who tweet exclusively about breaking New York news. And I will find out there quicker. I had photos. I was in the building when the Times Square bomb truck happened several months ago. I was in the building right above it. I just happened to be there. And I was sending photos to Twitter long before any of the mainstream media was covering it. So I think if you're interested in immediacy, there is a need for social media, among other needs, but definitely immediacy would be one of them.
Can I I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. Quick thing. I'll tell you what I think you're missing there, despite how well informed you would be in general, is you're missing the opportunity to engage with it, to participate in it. That's really the essence of what social networks are. It's sociology. It's all of us, and what this has allowed is the opportunity for lots of voices to engage with what's happening, rather than always be just the recipient of being told what to do. You can turn around and say, I have learned something from all of this reading and watching that I've done, and now here's a conversation that I can contribute to, and you can. That's really pretty exciting, and that's pretty new. And you can do that in a big level if you gain credibility and a lot of followers, or you can do it with your own crowd of friends who want to know what it is you have to say about things because they know you're a smart and well-informed person. So that's what the social network allows you to do. It's the old idea about who you could talk to when you went to the beauty shop or the barber shop or over the back fence, except now you can do that in a much bigger way and be part of that conversation. That's exciting.
I think our last question of the evening.
So my question is, who are the journalists and news media channels who are the trailblazers who we should follow and read that are making the best use of social media, the social media tools for the betterment of news? Like two that I know just from my own purview, and I'm not a journalist, are I love what Nicholas Kristof is doing at the New York Times, how he uses his blog, how he uses Twitter, and his articles, and I read all three, especially if I'm interested in what he has to say. And then also back when the Iranian protests were going on, there was an American journalist whose name escapes me who was blogging. He was on the ground and he was out there in the streets and he was blogging, and I just thought that his real-time use of the news and his skill. I just saw both of these guys, and I'm sure you guys have others, which I would love to know about, are the real trailblazers using social journalism today.
Okay, then.
Okay.
Absolutely no one.
I don't have a specific journalist. Channel 4, WBZ, is very good at engaging with their readers on not just Twitter, but Facebook as well. They have the whole question, I forget what they call it, but they have a daily question, which is generated by users.
Conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's like, sometimes the questions are kind of lame, but sometimes they're interesting questions. But they're also good in terms of breaking news, like on Twitter. A lot of news organizations will just spew out their headlines, but you don't get the sense that there's anybody behind these headlines. It's all just RSS generated. They have actual people, and you can talk to them. And if you have a question about a breaking news story, they will answer you. And if they don't know, they'll find it for you. As I mentioned earlier, Peter Abraham and Emily Benjamin on the Globe Sports desk are doing a very good job. One person who's kind of interesting is Roger Ebert. You know, it turns out there's a lot more to him than just films. You know, and he has a very interesting Twitter feed. You may get outraged depending on your political viewpoints with what he tweets, but it's a real person there. It's not, again, it's not an automated feed, which I think is a problem that a lot of news organizations have.
I'd say that the people who, in my opinion, who are doing it well, are the ones who don't just generate conversation. Anyone can generate conversation. I want to see people that engage. Julio Ojeda Zapata at Twin Cities, he's been on Twitter since like day one. I think he was Twitter user like 8, and he's phenomenal. Every article he does, he writes about his thoughts on why he wrote that article, and he covers a lot of tech, but why he wrote that article, what he was thinking when he was covering it, and he engages and answers questions. He doesn't just put the article out there. I think that if you have a Twitter stream and you have a Facebook page, you have a responsibility to, if you're going to put your information out there, your responsibility to engage your audience, not just broadcast. You want broadcast, go buy some radio time. There was an article in, I believe it was the Miami Herald, a couple of weeks ago about, it was an obituary. It was and someone correct me if I'm wrong, it was a man who was killed. He was hit on his, he was biking home. He was 48 years old. He worked as a
St. Petersburg
St.
Times.
Petersburg Times. He worked as a short order cook, and he was biking on his way home. He was 48 years old, and they wrote an article about the fact that he was killed. Some idiot in the comments section put, if he was still 48 years old and working as a short order cook, it's probably better that he died. And then what happened from there is that the reporter who did the original story went and interviewed everyone that this short order cook had ever interacted with and wrote an amazing 2,000-word obituary on this guy. And it was heartwarming. It was moving to me. And I wrote a really heartwarming, I wrote a letter back to this guy. I said, I just want to let you know, I've never worked with you. I didn't mention I was Harrow. Anything. I was just a reader who found this, and this really, really touched me. And I want to thank you for this article. And I never heard back. I'm like, why would you put your email there, even just to respond and say, glad to do it, anything? That killed the whole concept of his credibility online. So I think if you have the ability to engage your audience and you put your info out there, if you're not doing it, you're doing it poorly. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I think at this point we're out of time. I want to thank just a brilliant panel. I hope this was well worth your time tonight. I want to offer the opportunity for our panelists really briefly to pimp out anything they so desire. That could be as simple as their Twitter name, or go be you calm, whatever you feel like talking about. Dean, feel to start off with you.
Oh, I'm sorry, is this a shout out?
A shout out or a pimp out or anything you'd like to say, anything you'd like to end with?
Well, no, I want to point out to my brilliant, part of my brilliant faculty there, just raise your hands, and I know Joe Bergantino is in the back here, so just identify them. Thanks for coming.
Lisa?
I'm not going to pimp out the BBJ, but you can follow me on Twitter at L. Vanderpool.
Excellent.
Follow me at Universal Hub on Twitter.
Adam? Steve?
I've got nothing to pimp, actually, but I was just going to pick up on your brilliant question about what would one gain if one was consuming that kind of voracious media content. And just to sort of play one last time on the theme that these are not either-or dynamics, it's not traditional versus social. The research suggests that those who are active consumers of social media are disproportionately large consumers of traditional media. So I know for me, just one person, social media for me has become kind of my personal news service. So hopefully, in addition to consuming some of the kinds of publications you mentioned, I learn kind of over the transom about information from traditional media that I would have never stumbled upon were it not from this array of folks that I'm lucky enough to be loosely connected with.
My name is Peter Shankman. I blog at shankman.com, and my Twitter is Peter Shankman. And again, thank you all for coming, and thanks to my panel.